Hello, everyone. My name is Shivonne Nixon, and I'm an associate psychologist at the Wellness Center. Today, I will be presenting on EMDR therapy. The aim of today's presentation is to give you a snapshot into this very amazing, fascinating therapeutic approach. But before I go any further, I also want to take the time to let you know that today's presentation is also in honor of this year's World Mental Health Day. As we know, mental health is very, very important. And so, in honor of this year's World Mental Health Day, I thought it would be helpful to share with you a treatment approach such as EMDR because it's been found to be very helpful in bringing about healing. So, what exactly is EMDR? Well, I'd like to highlight that EMDR is an acronym which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing. I know it's a mouthful. Thank goodness for acronyms. So let's look at the background of EMDR. As you can see, EMDR was developed in 1987 and it was developed by Francine Shapiro. Interestingly enough, one day Francine by chance discovered that the rapid movements of her eyes helped to ameliorate the negative thoughts that she was having and the negative emotions associated with those negative thoughts. So fascinated by this discovery, she of course, started to explore it further and research it further. And thanks to her efforts and those associated with her, we are where we are today with EMDR therapy. I'd also like to take this time to highlight that back in 1987, EMDR was known as EMD, eye movement desensitization, and at the time it was used to treat PTSD and it operated from a behavioral model. Then in 1990, it got renamed to EMDR because Francine realized that there was a reprocessing part that was occurring, and so it got renamed, and the model that EMDR is currently operating from is an adaptive information processing model. So it's important to note that EMDR is highly evidence-based and it's also client-centered. It's very important when therapeutic modalities are client-centered because as a client, you want to be in the driver's seat of your therapeutic experience, and EMDR allows you to have that. It's also important to note that EMDR can be used across the lifespan, so it can be used to treat conditions that children are experiencing, teens are experiencing, as well as, it can be used to treat adults. And what's also fascinating about this therapeutic modality is that in a short span of time, it can bring about rapid healing. So, what is trauma? I bring this up because, as I mentioned, EMDR was originally used to treat PTSD, and it continues to be used to treat PTSD and other related trauma disorders. But what is trauma? A lot of the times we think about big traumatic experiences like hurricanes, wars, or abuse, right? Whether that be physical, sexual, but we may not realize that trauma can be smaller than those experiences, right? Trauma can come from grief, right? If we've experienced divorce, that can be traumatic. If we've experienced bullying, that can be traumatic. So there are a lot of experiences that can be traumatic, which is why trauma is any adverse experience that triggers emotional distress. When we look at EMDR, we also need to keep in mind that it can be used to treat conditions that are not organically based. What does that mean? So, if a person's condition is a result of some previous negative experience that they had, EMDR is applicable and can be used because that condition does not have an organic base. It's not biological. That condition was laid down because of a negative experiential event, right? So if we've had a negative experience, EMDR can be helpful in helping us heal from that. So this slide is just to kind of show some of the other conditions that EMDR can be effective for. So as you can see, PTSD is at the top of the list, but as we scan down it, it can also be helpful for anxiety and depression, right? And as we know, anxiety, depression are very common mental health illnesses. In fact, they are the common coals of mental health disorders, right? And so it's helpful to know that some treatment modality like EMDR can be used for these common disorders. And other disorders that it can be helpful for are things like addictions, dissociative disorders, eating disorders, sleep disturbance. What are the components of EMDR? So at the heart of EMDR is this three-prong protocol. What is that? Well, the three-prong protocol looks at a person's past, present, and future. So as I mentioned earlier, right, a lot of the experiences that we have got laid down by some previous negative experience. And so this is where the past comes in. So in treatment, we're looking at what negative past experience did you have or did this person have that led them to have this distress, right? And so once we've identified that experience and we process that experience and we clear it out, we then move on to the present. And with the present, we're working on what current triggers are contributing to that disturbance. And so we process that, we work on that, and we clear that out. But we don't stop there. We then go into the future because it's about laying down a future template, a template that allows us to know how we would handle potential triggers in the future. And so that we would know how to make good choices should those potential triggers happen in the future. And so when it looks at when we're looking at EMDR, there are targets. So these targets are, the negative experiences that we are working on. And when we work on these targets, we're looking at images associated with that negative experience, negative cognitions associated with that negative experience, negative emotions associated with that experience, how distressing are those emotions. But then we're also looking at what positive cognition do we want to have in place of that negative cognition. And as I mentioned earlier, EMDR is highly structured. So it's an 8-phase approach, which we'll look at momentarily. And an important component of EMDR is this bilateral stimulation. So bilateral meaning that both sides of the body experience the stimulation. And so EMDR, the bilateral stimulation can either be visual, tactile, or auditory. When we're looking at the visual stimulation, that is where the fingers come into play and they are moved in a back and forth rhythmic movement like that. And so this bilateral stimulation is what is used to stimulate the information processing system. So here are the 8 phases of EMDR. The first phase is the client history. And so this is where we're gathering background information on the client, finding out what negative experiences they've had, what support systems they have in place, whether there are any safety concerns, and ultimately, is EMDR an appropriate treatment modality? If it is deemed to be an appropriate treatment modality, we then move on to phase two, which is the preparation phase. This is where we're, providing psychoeducation on EMDR. We're looking at emotional regulation skills. And then after phase two, we move on to phase three. This assessment phase is where we're establishing a baseline. So we're looking at what are the targets, what are the negative cognitions, the positive cognitions, how distressed does that person feel at that point in time, so that we can establish a baseline. And then we move on to phase four, which is desensitization. And so this is where we're working on minimizing that distress. And so maybe several sets of that bilateral stimulation will be done so that that distress can be near zero. And once that distress has been reduced, then we move on to phase five. And so this is the installation of that positive cognition that was identified. And then phase six, that body scan. So when it comes to trauma, the body keeps the score. And so, trauma comes with somatic experiences. So that body scan, we're scanning to see if there's any residual disturbance there. And if there is, then we go back and we process, we clear that out. And then finally, closure. We want to make sure that before the session ends, the client is in a state of emotional equilibrium. And then phase eight doesn't come into play until the next session. And so this is where you're going back and reviewing the previous session and looking to see if the gains that were made, if they were maintained. So how does EMDR work exactly? So at the top there, I have trauma is state specific. So what does that mean? So as I mentioned just now, the body keeps score. So when a traumatic experience happens, that information gets stored exactly how that experience happened. So even years later, the body still remembers the experience as if it is happening in the present moment, because that is how that information was maladaptively stored. Right? And so when we do the bilateral stimulation, that's allowing the client to process that maladaptive information so that it can then become adaptive. So in that moment of processing, the person is half in the present and half in the past as they are processing that past experience. And so once the information processing system has been activated by the bilateral stimulation, that maladaptive experience that was formed gets to be reprocessed into something adaptive. And it's at that point where a lot of integration can happen, meaning if you've had previous therapy and you learned tools but you weren't really able to access them, this is that point in time where you would be able to fully access them, because that maladaptive information was reprocessed. And so now the mind is, thinking a lot healthier, and things can be utilized from the previous therapies. So EMDR can help you move from a state of distress to a state of healing and peace. Thank you so much for listening and taking the time to hear my presentation. And if you are interested in EMDR, you're seeking healing, and you want that extra support, please scan the QR code and let's meet. Have a good day.